As a historian, what's more interesting is how did Brigham Young differ, or how is he similar from his contemporaries? How is he different or similar from the prophet Joseph Smith? And so to recognize that leaders were racists and products of their culture and that had racist views that were common in their generation, that should not be shocking to people. The story here should not be to sugarcoat and to sweeten, because millennials and others don't, they see right through that.
Yes.
The story is, yes, it's true. President so-and-so was a racist back in the day. It's true. He was influenced by the broader American culture. But this is what the church teaches today. And that's why that race in the priesthood essay is so significant, because people could really share that. And I really wish this were not true, but I wish that essay and the other essays in that series had a greater circulation. Sometimes I'm still astonished that they've been out since 2013, a number of them, and there's still a number of Latter-day Saints who don't know anything about them.
It is time for another episode of The Cultural Hall, and I'm excited about this because I thought that I had talked to Matt Harris before, but it turns out I have just listened to him so many times on so many other podcasts that I feel like I know him very well. Matt, I'm glad to have you here in The Cultural Hall. Welcome on in.
Oh, thank you, Richie.
Now, put yourself in context for people. I know that you, a few years back, had a book that you wrote about Ezra Taft Benson that, did the circuit and learned a lot about that gentleman. You have also done a considerable amount about like the race ban, the black ban and the priesthood. You have done things about the LDS essays. Tell me a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I grew up in Maine and had a wonderful experience growing up in Maine. The church is much smaller in Maine than it is, of course, in the corridor of the church. And, my dad always taught us growing up, the typical Mormon answer, right, which is, make sure you date people in the church, son.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad never thought that through. Dad, who do you want me to date? My sister? I mean, there was nobody else.
Yeah. These are the choices, Dad.
The choices were not good. So I settled on a good Catholic girl. And anyway, but so I grew up in Maine, had a wonderful experience, and went to BYU and loved it there. Had a great education, served an LDS church mission to Idaho, and my patriarchal blessing said that I would serve a mission to a place and to a people with whom I was not familiar. Idaho.
Oh, that's fair, though. Coming from Maine, I think that's a fulfillment of prophecy for sure.
Well, that's true, I think. So, I mean, I think I took 2 years of Spanish in high school, 2 or 3 years, and I interpreted that to mean that I would go Spanish speaking. But, people in Idaho, I mean, I loved going to Idaho. I thought the people were wonderful. I didn't have to worry about food, meat and potatoes, what's not to like.
Sure.
So it was really terrific. It was also my first encounter up close and personal with a large concentration of Latter-day Saints, and also people who are critics of the church. Whenever there's a large concentration, you of course get a counterculture. And so as a missionary, I was front and center in this counterculture.
What was that experience like, going from, hey, the only person I can date is my sister, to, wow, there are thousands of you and you all think relatively the same way, and here's a large group of people that don't like us so much? Well, personally, what was that experience like?
Well, in Maine growing up, I mean, I'm joking a little bit. There were some young women in the stake, of course, but they weren't in our ward. We had to go outside of the stake, and we would meet people at stake dances. But the youth in the 1980s in Maine, I mean, it was just assumed that you would go out to one of the church schools. I mean, it was expected that when you graduated from high school, that's where you needed to be to move along with your life, to find a partner, to prepare for a mission. And so we Maynards, as we like to say, I mean, that's what you did. And so, when you got to BYU, of course, it was a whole new experience, because you had never been around, at least over a sustained period of time, a large concentration of saints. I mean, they had youth conferences in Maine. They didn't have EFY where people would fly into, Utah or BYU in those days.
Right.
But we would be around other saints throughout the state, and sometimes throughout New England, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. But as you can imagine, for somebody who was grown up in the church where, members were few and far between, getting to BYU was a real treat.
Yeah. So you get around saints, you decide to do the mission thing, you come back, you do the BYU thing, and then when is it that you start to go, hey, you know what, I'm going to study these really eccentric is not the word, but these really significant characters in LDS history, these groups that are very impacted? When is it that you went from like, oh, I'm just kind of here, to this is going to be my life scholarship?
Well, when I was on my mission, I really, really took it seriously. So I went to Idaho, and of course, a lot of people know about the church.
Mm-hmm.
Either they were already members or they don't ever want to be a member. There seemed to be no in between.
Right.
I say that a little bit, tongue in cheek, because we did have a lot of success with baptisms. But when I got on my mission, I didn't know as much about the church, and it bothered me when people asked questions. We tracked it into a professor of anthropology at Idaho State. I served at Pocatello, and this young professor, he was probably in his late 20s, as I recall. He wasn't a whole lot older than us, but he was asking some very specific questions, and I'd been out maybe 2 or 3 weeks at that point, and I felt so inadequate answering these questions. And I don't think he meant to embarrass either of us, my companion or myself, but I went back and I told my companion, this is never going to happen again.
Mm.
So I went above and beyond the prescribed reading. We had to read LeGrand Richards' Marvelous Work and a Wonder. We had to read Jesus the Christ by Talmage, a couple of other approved books.
They came in a set of like 7, right? There was the little ones that would kind of come together. Jesus Christ, Man's Search for Happiness. There's like 7 that would come in a little set.
That was later, Richie. Man's Search for Happiness wasn't in our mission.
Oh.
I think that was later. We had to do LeGrand Richards, Talmage, I think Gospel Principles. And there might have been one more, but it wasn't Man's Search for Happiness, as I recall. But anyway, those books were fine, but they didn't help to answer questions from this professor. And growing up in the early morning LDS seminary program in Maine, one can imagine that missionaries are not prepared from that experience. And I should say that, the Maine people who sacrifice their time and their sleep, I mean, they were wonderful. It's a commentary on a teenager, right?
Sure.
Wanting to sleep rather than learn scriptures at 6 a.m.
But were there
anyway,
questions that he asked you, were they about leadership in the church? Were they about race in the church? What were those things that he sort of stirred up inside you?
I think they were he was focused on LDS truth claims. What do you mean there's a restoration? Asked about the Book of Mormon. There's no evidence that there was this ancient book in the America. I mean, he's an anthropologist, right? So he's drilling down hard on the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And, early morning seminary did not prepare us for Book of Mormon archaeology. And so I dove into Nibley. And I dove into a guy named John Sorensen, whose book, An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, really gave me grounding about these kinds of debates and discussions. And so I really, really studied hard, and I was always a good rule follower. We got up every morning. I got up earlier, actually, so I could do the extra reading. And then sometimes we'd get back to our apartment late at night, and I would study some more. So I was just determined. Well, anyway, your question was, when did I get involved in history? On my mission.
Mm-hmm.
But then I got back to my mission, went to BYU, went into the history department, and I took a Utah history class where I'm learning about Utah, or about polygamy, for the first time. I mean, I knew it was there, but now I'm learning details.
Yeah.
I'm learning about statehood, all of that stuff. And one of my professors told me, he said, pulled me aside, this is during my undergraduate years, he said, do not do Mormon history. It's like quicksand. Once you're in, you'll never get out. And so I took that to heart. I read Mormon history. I enjoyed it, but that was not my focus as an undergraduate. 18th century American history was. And so I went to graduate school in early American history with other fields of study, legal history, modern history, but not Mormon history.
Mm-hmm.
And the first 10 years of my career, I was publishing books on early America, the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, religion, things like that. And then probably around 2008, 2009, I switched careers. I wanted to look at my own faith tradition, and the priesthood ban always interested me. It was always told so poorly by the church. The manuals, President Kimball had a revelation, June 1st, it caught the church off guard. And I knew there was more to the story than that. I just had a hunch. And so I did a first book on the topic in 2015. I'll show it up here. It's did it with the distinguished Mormon historian guy named Noel Bringhurst.
It's called The Mormon Church and Blacks.
a documentary history. And I'm proud to say that they had used this book in the BYU religion department to restructure some of their curriculum on this subject. I just was informed that not too long ago by one of the religion faculty. They also sold this book at Desert Book, which surprised me, because the book is, anybody who knows my work knows that I don't sugarcoat, I don't add artificial preservatives or sweeteners. I'm a scholar. And so I just go where the evidence takes me. And I was so pleased when Desert Book sold this, because it showed me that they were interested in transparency and getting the story right. So anyway, one thing led to another. I realized that only a small fraction of the research I did over the years went into this book. And this book is a much different book than the current book. And so I decided that when I got access to Spencer W. Kimball's papers, that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, then I realized there was a story there, because President Kimball's remarkable leadership, he's the one that oversaw the lifting of the ban.
Now, the new book is called Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. People can find a link for it in the show notes. A huge shout out to the Oxford Press for aligning us with Matt and being able to publish this and put this out into the world. I want to ask you about just the title initially. I think that it is gripping. It gets your attention to say Second Class Saints. Can you tell me a little bit about why, like, that title?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Richie. That's a really important question. And this was not my choice of title. My choice of title was The Long-Awaited Day, playing off of Elder McConkey's famous sermon he gave in August of 1978. But the editors came up with this. We went the rounds on this.
Sure.
And I was really, really reluctant to use this title, because the editor, he said, well, this is really what the book is about. And I said, well, I suppose, but I don't want that. I want to be sensitive to my LDS readers. And this could be challenging for them, because nobody wants to be told that, they're called second class, or a certain subset of the church is called second class. And so we went the rounds on this, and I reached out to friends. I agonized over this. I went for long hikes, and I went through probably 10 different title proposals. I reached out to a lot of different friends, some of whom are endorsers on the back of the book, Patrick Mason and some others. And anyway, we locked horns, I guess, if you will, with the editor. He's like, no, this is what we're going to do. And so it is what it is. But it is a tough book, and it's certainly not how I feel about Black Latter-day Saints. I know it's not how the people that I know who are in the church feel about Black Latter-day Saints, but it's a description of a theology that had positioned them as less than for years and for decades. And I'm happy to say I just returned from the Mormon History Association conference, which is the largest professional gathering of scholars of Mormon studies around the world. And these are people who are LDS. These are people who are not LDS, former LDS. So it brings together a confluence of groups. And the report that I'm getting from this book and from podcasts that I've done, it's overwhelmingly positive. The church is really pushing for transparency. Let's not sugarcoat it. This was a racist doctrine for so many years. We need to own up to it. And the people whose opinions I value the most, many of whom work for the church, they're the ones praising this. And I also should say that in my opinion, some of the brethren, I write this in the book, but some of the brethren are really trying to be transparent and trying to say, hey, look, man, this is what happened, and let's not sugarcoat it. We need to deal with this head on, because you can't address racism in the present unless you deal with it in the past. And I think there's a number of church leaders who see it that way.
Well, and I appreciate that sentiment. We'll certainly get into that within our discussion as well. What I don't want to take the side of the publisher necessarily, but what I liked about the title is it made me go, well, I don't know that I like that. So instantly, before I had even cracked the cover, I'm thinking, how do I feel about that terminology? And had already started to kind of look inward and go, how does that feel and all that? So I would like to start what I feel like is super basic. And so I don't want you to feel like I don't know about this, but I think that it's important, because I think it's, to many Latter-day Saints today, such a foreign thing. The basic question is what is the priesthood ban? And why do we call it a priesthood ban? Because it was never sort of And now heretofore from this day in 1800 we shall not. So let's just start there.
Well, it's not just a priesthood ban, Richie. It's a temple ban too.
Uh-huh.
And for years, members of the church, including the leadership, the brethren, and the lay members, for years it was just called colloquially a priesthood ban.
Mm-hmm.
But in the last 10 years or so, myself and other scholars have been calling it a temple ban as well, because that is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't, our Black brothers and sisters were not just denied the priesthood, but also temple privileges. They did have some limited temple privileges over the years. For example, Black saints could do proxy baptisms, but that was about it. They couldn't do the endowment. They couldn't get sealed, all of in the temple in the endowment. So that's why we do it. It started in 1852. And as a scholar, I look at, why did it start in 1852 with the second prophet president, Brigham Young? Why not with Joseph Smith?
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph Smith ordained a handful of Black men, or at least they were ordained under his leadership. So he knew that was happening. He accepted it. He approved it. But then it changes drastically under his successor. Why is that?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that my book points out in an early chapter is that Brigham Young was afraid of interracial marriage, and he was afraid that some Black men, one of whom held the priesthood, were marrying white women in plural relationships. And so one Black man named William McCary went to Brigham Young and explained that, there are some saints that aren't treating me well. And Brigham Young commiserated with him. He said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. We have another great Black member who's a priesthood holder in Massachusetts." This would have been at winter quarters in Nebraska when he's meeting with this William McCary fellow. And so he told him about another Black priesthood holder in Massachusetts, and God is no respecter of persons. So he was really encouraging. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden, Young changes his mind when he learns that William McCary and a couple of other Black brothers are taking white wives in polygamous relationships, which is really a practice reserved for white people, white priesthood holders. And so in 1852, when he announces to the Utah legislature that there'll be a ban on the priesthood, it's the interracial fear that's driving this. And one of the things that Young said that would just be so shocking to us today, but he said that if people marry interracially, they will have to spill their own blood to atone for it. And this is part of one of his controversial teachings that, of course, the church does not teach today. But for a short period in the 19th century, they taught blood atonement. And Young taught that interracial couples would have to suffer or experience a blood atonement in order to expiate their sins.
And so a little further, if you had, say, like if I had a white parent and a Black parent and I was, mixed, I couldn't, and then my descendants couldn't go to the temple. How did that, from a very either genealogical or physical sense, who were those people that were banned? How did that part of that ban work? Does that make sense?
I think so. So we're dealing with temple, which is really an important question. There's a scholar in the church. He's a wonderful scholar. I'll do a shout out to Jonathan Stapley. He's got a book coming out on the temple, probably next year. And I just critiqued his chapter on race that deals with the temple. And in the 19th century, there were light-skinned Latter-day Saints who were flying below the color line, as we say. That is, they were passing as white, even though they had African ancestry. Mm-hmm. And the church followed an old slave law, which said that you would be deemed a Negro, as they used in those days, if you had one drop of African blood. That simply means if you had 100 ancestors, and if one of those had African lineage, you would be deemed cursed. Mm. Now, think about this for a moment. There are no ways to determine this, right? I mean, it's kind of comical in a lot of ways, but the church wasn't unique. A lot of people were following the one drop rule, trying to distinguish between somebody who could be Anglo versus somebody who could bear an African curse, a biblical curse. And of course, the church, Latter-day Saints leaders were not the only ones promoting biblical curses. This had long been done among Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims. So the church had just inherited this sort of thing uncritically and moved it forward. And so in the 19th century, they couldn't tell who bore the curse. And these light-skinned Latter-day Saints were going to the temple and being sealed in the temple I talk about this in chapter 2 of my book.
Mhm.
And the million-dollar question is, did the Brethren know about this? Did Brigham Young know about it? And the answer is probably not, because they looked white, even though their great-great-great-grandfather may have originated from Africa. And so this was going on, and there were a lot of instances in the 19th century where there were some Black Latter-day Saints like Jane Manning James, a guy named Elijah Abel. They want to experience the salvific ordinances of the temple, but the Brethren turn them down because they bear a biblical curse. And in the 20th century, it gets really, really interesting because now the church starts to globalize. They want to fulfill their, mandate to spread the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. And that means moving into majority Black and biracial countries like Brazil, like South Africa, places like that. And so what happens is they get the first presidency, they receive letters from all around the world asking, we've got this biracial couple, or the word they use in those days would be mulatto. We've got this mulatto couple, they want to go to the temple. And the Brethren always said, well, no, if they have that curse, they can't go. And then by the mid-20th century, by about the time of World War II, they start getting interesting questions from white couples, white Latter-day Saint couples asking, my husband and I just adopted 2 Black children. Can we have them sealed to us? And David O. McKay said, no, you can't. But later, Spencer W. Kimball, when he was the church president, reversed that and said you can. And this would have been before the ban was lifted. So the upshot of this story, I think, Richie, is that the Brethren are struggling with this theology. I mean, they're just taking them as they come, and they're trying to determine, what they think God would want them to do.
Yeah. Let's take a break real quick. When we come back in the second block, I want to pick it up kind of mid to late 20th century and to what the road looks like before the ban is lifted. We'll come back and do that in the second block of the Cultural Hall.
Imagine running a small business today. It's challenging. Imaging and internet presence is an absolute must. Even with that, you're still a small star in a bright cyber universe. Now, imagine you have someone who understands how to get your site designed for your talents and then easily searched by potential clients. Imagine Lennon Design. Whether it's strictly a website or a whole package of logo creation, advertising media, and promotional materials, Lennon Design is your partner in business. They'll test the boundaries of their imagination to create something unique for you. When you need creative, affordable design, let it be Lennon Design. Call 801-699-3022 or visit LennonDesign.com.
Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember, you can always send us an email, contact@theculturalhall.com. If you find this episode as fascinating as I do, you can certainly send a message that says, man, Matt is so great. I love him so much. Have him back so many times. You can send that in an email. I may even forward that along to him. It's contact@theculturalhall.com. So, Matt, it's interesting to me. 21st century ears are hearing these things, and I'm just like, how were we ever in this place ever? It was very real for hundreds of years for the, or a couple hundred years for the saints, that this is the experience that they had. And as we started to look more globally, as you indicated, the growth of the church has essentially stopped at some point with the ban still being in place. Is it a ban that was changed due to social pressure? Is it a ban that was changed due to our need and desire for growth and fulfillment of prophecy? Is it we're tired of being, bothered by it in press conferences and in those kind of things? What do you think it was that started to utz us towards lifting the ban?
Well, of course, I'm a scholar, so there are no single variables, right?
Sure.
But I have thought long and hard about this. And the biggest thing that's pushing the end of the ban, probably 2 things. One would be President Kimball's vision to globalize the church. When he was called as the church president, he had given this magnificent sermon in which he articulates that every member a missionary, we need to spread the gospel behind the Iron Curtain. And it absolutely thrills the leadership of the church. I mean, it gives them a vision that will last well into the 1970s. People, your audience, your listeners of an older generation will know that sermon because it was published in the Ensign magazine and other mediums. And so President Kimball recognized intuitively that you can't spread the gospel if you have this dreadful ban in place.
Right.
And so that was his vision. The other thing, too, is it's the civil rights movement, this national movement, this national awakening for racial equality. It was impossible for the church to maintain this ban after the 1960s. And especially when you're one of the last holdouts, right? A lot of mainstream Protestant and Catholic churches are readjusting their theology in the wake of the civil rights movement. And there are still some, fringe evangelicals, some fringe, fundamentalists on the margins. But for the most part, I don't think Latter-day Saints wanted to be on the fringe with some of those, fundamentalists. And so President Kimball was he was aware, as were the other brethren, that the constant criticism would harm the church's mission. Wherever they went, the Washington, D.C. temple dedication in 1974 and elsewhere, they were being constantly bombarded with questions by the media about when the ban would be lifted. And from a church leader, that's the last thing you want to talk about, right?
Sure.
Something that's perceived as negative. You want to talk about the positive things of the faith. So the brethren were being slammed with that. They couldn't determine who had the blood, as they put it, who bore the curse. It was impossible. They knew they were ordaining and conferring the priesthood on people of Black and biracial descent. They knew this. They talk about it in their quorum minutes and meetings. And so I think those 3 or 4 factors really come to bear with President Kimball. And I want to share something for your listeners that I think is really instructive. And I'm going to do it by way of a story.
Okay.
And the story is that I knew that when I wanted to tell this story, to write this book, Second Class Saints, I needed access to President Kimball's papers. And the church is very guarded with contemporary church officers, their papers, their diaries. There's a number of reasons for that. They've been more transparent in recent years with older church leaders, Brigham Young, others. But by recent, World War II forward, maybe, those collections are shut off. And so I remember calling Edward Kimball, President Kimball's son, and also biographer. Edward Kimball wrote 2 wonderful biographies of his father and his presidency. And so I remember calling Ed Kimball one day out of the blue and introduced myself. And I said, "Do you have your father's papers? I need to see them. I'm writing a book." And of course, the last thing that somebody wants to do is give a stranger like me their diaries, right?
Sure.
Their family jewels.
Yeah.
And I understood that. And so we had several lengthy phone conversations. And finally, he invited me to Provo. And I knew that would be the big interview. And we spent probably 7 or 8 hours in his study talking about these very ideas. And the story I want to share derives from this lengthy interview. We had a meal together. It was just a wonderful experience. His daughter was there. And so there were 3 of us talking. And I said, "Ed," this would have been 2013, so a very long time ago.
Yeah.
I said, "Ed, I have a hunch that your dad was going to lift the ban the minute he became the church president, but he needed to spend the time getting buy-in from the quorum. And he was also worried about how the saints in the South would feel." And Ed's eyes got really big and he said, "You're right." And this is stuff that he couldn't write in his book. And so I said, "I'm going to give you my evidence now." Now, keep in mind, I had enough evidence at that point to make these claims, but I hadn't really seen the diaries yet, which further confirmed my views. I said, "A couple things, Ed. One is, in 1963, he wrote you a letter saying that the ban may have been a possible error." That's the word he used.
Wow.
May have been a possible error. Ed looked at me and he said, "I remember that." And secondly, most critically, Spencer Kimball, Ed didn't know this, Spencer Kimball had agreed to support HughBBrown, this iconic first presidency counselor, this beloved general authority, one of the church's greatest orators of the 20th century. HughBBrown did not like the ban and led a charge with David O. McKay's sons to get it lifted in September of 1969. They were going to ordain a Black man to the priesthood named Monroe Fleming, who worked at the Hotel Utah, which is owned by the church.
Which is now the Joseph Smith Memorial Building.
Which is now the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. And Ed Kimball had no idea that any of this was going down. I said, "Your dad supported this." And so that was 1969. 4 years later, he's now in the hot seat. He's the church president. So the question I frequently get asked is, well, if he wanted to lift the ban, why didn't he do it in 1974?
Yeah.
And that's a good question, right?
Yeah.
And so the president, this is hard for some Latter-day Saints to recognize because they think, oh, he's the prophet. He can do whatever he wants. But you have to consider the pragmatic elements of this. You have to understand personalities and leadership styles and different life experiences. And President Kimball could have lifted the ban unilaterally if he wanted to, but he was a student of history. He saw what had happened in 1890 when Wilford Woodruff proclaimed a revelation without getting the buy-in from his counselors and the 12. It divided the church. Some of the apostles left the church over it because they supported polygamy. They thought the higher law would trump a man-made law.
Sure.
And a number of saints left and joined fundamentalist schismatic groups. And President Kimball was mindful of history. And so he recognized that if he were to make this far-reaching policy and practice change and doctrinal change, that he would need the buy-in from each member of the Quorum of the 12. And Section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants talks about how this is supposed to work, that revelation is a process, not an event. And the process means that you have to get unanimity in order to move the church forward.
And so that would lead me to then believe that among the apostles at the time, that there were some that were like, nope, never, let's never do this, or at very least, were not favorable towards lifting the ban.
Yeah, this is jarring for people to hear, some people anyway, because the church has not told this story as well as they could. And again, on June 1st, there was a revelation. They all agreed to it. God spoke, and that was it. The truth is, it's far more complex than this. HughBBrown, David O. McKay, and others had been agitating to lift the ban for a long time, but you got to get buy-in. They couldn't get buy-in from the hardliners in church leadership, men who interpreted the scriptures differently. And President Kimball, when his leadership is absolutely brilliant, he recognized that if he were to lift the ban, which he felt called to do, he felt that this is what God wanted. We need to expand the church, and we can't do that with this ban. And so he targeted Elder McConkey first. He knew that what Elder McConkey said mattered. And
just for clarification, this is Bruce R.
This is BruceRMcConkey, the church's most significant doctrinal authority in the late 20th century. And when his father-in-law, Joseph Fielding Smith, died, BruceRMcConkey inherited that mantle, that he was to defend the doctrines of the church, maintain its doctrinal purity. And it used to be Joseph Fielding Smith who carried that role. Now it's BruceRMcConkey. And now I've been told it's Dallin H. Oaks. So conversation for another day.
Yeah, although a fascinating one. So put a pin in that, because maybe we'll invite you back and have that conversation. So goes to BruceRMcConkey and says, come on.
So President Kimball poses the issue to Elder McConkey by saying, we've got this new temple that's been proposed by HaroldBLee. He couldn't see it fulfilled. He passed away. Now that falls to my shoulders. And President Kimball uses the Brazil temple as leverage. He recognizes that the path to the priesthood goes through Brazil. And so it's a biracial country. Now think about this for a minute, Richie. You're going to build a beautiful temple in a biracial country. The saints who contribute their hard-earned money to this temple are the ones who will not be permitted to enter.
Right.
This just crushes President Kimball. And he's getting reports back from Jim Faust, who was the general authority in charge at the time. This is before Faust was in the 12. And well, it was actually before and during. President Faust was called into the 12 in 1977. And then, well, anyway, becomes the first presidency counselor to Gordon Hinckley in the 80s, or in the 90s. But so Elder McConkey, he poses as a problem to Elder McConkey. He said, we've got this new temple in Brazil, and we don't know how to issue a temple recommend. These people have biracial blood. What do we do? And I mean, President Kimball knows what needs to be done, right?
Sure.
He wants Elder McConkey to be part of the solution. So McConkey says, well, we need to lift the ban. And he said, there's no scriptural impediments to keeping the ban alive, which is really an astonishing statement, right? Elder McConkey had been defending the ban scripturally for all these years, and now he's telling the church president in March of 1977, there's no scriptural impediment to lifting the ban.
Right.
And then McConkey says two other things to the church president, and he writes them in a long, lengthy memo that I cite in my book. He says that we cannot, we have to spread the gospel, and that includes even to Negroes, as he puts it. And so we have to lift the ban. Jesus can't come again and claim his kingdom unless we spread the gospel to the Negroes. And then lastly, Elder McConkey creates new theology to accommodate the sweeping changes. He says something that was not church doctrine, but he creates new doctrine with President Kimball's support. And he says that Black people can be adopted into the house of Israel and enjoy all of the covenant blessings through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And just a reminder to your Latter-day Saint, maybe non-Latter-day Saint audience, the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are temple blessings. And those are the blessings that one has to have in order to enjoy the highest degree of fulfillment in the afterlife, or the celestial kingdom, as Latter-day Saints call it. Mm-hmm. So he's creating new doctrine. And in 1972, when Spencer Kimball was the president of the Quorum of the 12, he asked HaroldBLee and Joseph Fielding Smith, the two leaders, he said, is it the doctrine of the church that Black people could be adopted into the house of Israel? And they write back, no, that's not the doctrine of the church. Mm-hmm. And here you have 5 years later, Elder McConkey saying the exact opposite. And obviously, President Kimball is the new president. And of course, one of the beauties of modern Mormon theology is modern day revelation. A new president is not always beholden to what the strictures of previous presidents. And so, as I like to say, sort of colloquially, we have a new sheriff in town. And President Kimball is allowing Elder McConkey to create this new doctrinal rationale because it's going to justify moving the church forward in Black and biracial countries.
So you talk about how, and I think that it still exists to this date in 2024, that the church within its highest leadership tries to have unanimous. Why can I say it? It's unanimous. There we go. The question that then I would have, so he gets Elder McConkey on board. Is there the one last holdout among the group, or do we not know how that? Because we're still talking mid-70s before the ban is lifted in the late 70s. Is it a matter of President Kimball going to each one and going, all right, Matt, let's talk about this. What can I answer for you? What is it that individual like that? And is there one last lone holdout that finally goes, all right, I'll be unanimous with everyone else. Come on.
Yeah, it's both. President Kimball meets with the brethren collectively and individually. And he really, really picks up steam. Let me back up for a moment. Let's just go through this for a quick second. So Elder McConkey in March of 77 comes around, agrees to lift the ban. And President Kimball's two counselors go next, Marion Romney and Nathan Tanner. And it's interesting with those two, they tell President Kimball, we've defended this ban with conviction for all of these years.
Yeah.
And we're prepared to defend it to the death. But if this is what you think the church needs to do, we will support you 1,000%. And so his counselors and Elder McConkey come on board. Tom Monson and Boyd Packer come on board early on. And if that's kind of jarring, Elder Packer was close friends with McConkey. He was kind of a doctrinal hardliner. He was a theological conservative. And Tom Monson's a moderate. But I have to remind people that Tom Monson, Boyd Packer, and GordonBHinckley, who also comes on board early on, they were the advisors to the Genesis group in the early 70s. This is a quick aside. And the Genesis group was an all-Black support group in the church in the early 70s. Of course, they couldn't have the priesthood, but they could meet together with Relief Society, they could have a sacrament meeting, or sacrament meeting would come later, but they would meet in the auxiliary services of the church overseen by priesthood holders. It was just a support group, right, to give people, Black saints, a space where they could meet and talk and share their burdens. So Monson, Hinckley, and Packer were the apostolic advisors to that group, and they saw firsthand the dissension that it created in the Genesis group because these men wanted the priesthood. And these men and women wanted to be sealed in the temple. And the long story short is that a number of them left the group and left the church because they were tired of being treated like second-class saints.
Sure.
And so to Elder Packer, Elder Monson, and Elder Hinckley's credit, they saw that firsthand. More than any other apostle, they witnessed it. They knew these people. They met with them. They went to their meetings. And they saw the anguish that these Black saints had experienced over not being able to participate fully in the church's rituals. And so they came on board in the spring of 77. So there are 5 apostles. Now there are a few others that are absolutely, they're just not They're hard to budge. MarkEPeterson, DelbertLStapley, there were no indications in the months and days leading up to the revelation that they saw a place for Black people in the church. No evidence.
Yeah.
And Ezra Taft Benson was the third one. And in the spring of 78 is when President Kimball really, really feels like God's calling him, that this is the time to do this. But what do you do if you're the church president? You feel like God wants you to do this, but yet you've got holdouts.
Yeah.
And you know what Section 107 says. And the brethren would remind him every time President Kimball would meet with them in the temple collectively, they would say, hey, look, you can't do this. You need our support. Let's read Section 107 again, President. I mean, he knows what the revelation says. So he meets with them in private, and he still can't win over Elder Peterson and Elder Stapley and Elder Benson. And so in March, he tries to lift the ban. They don't agree with it. In May, he is prepared to do this. He writes out a revelation, Ed Kimball told me, in private. This is in May. He's writing out a revelation to lift the ban. Mm-hmm. And then on June 1st, he decided that that would be the day he would do it. And he made sure that Elder Peterson was away on church assignment in Ecuador because he couldn't win over Elder Peterson. He made sure that Elder Stapley wasn't there. He was in the hospital on an illness. And the only holdout that day on June 1st was Ezra Taft Benson. And as they started to talk about the ban, so they had their apostolic meeting on Thursdays, which is a practice they've had for a long time. Mm-hmm. They had their typical meeting. And then President Kimball asked them to stay, rather than go to lunch, he wanted them to stay and talk about the ban. And the first person, I'm told, who wanted to table the discussion was Elder Benson. Table. When you ask to table something, that's a nice polite way of saying, I don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
You've been bringing this up, President Kimball, for weeks and months. I don't want to talk about this. And President Kimball, who is a mild-mannered man, but also had sort of a fiery side to him that some people wouldn't see. And you get that fiery side when you read his diaries. But he told Elder Kimball, he said, we're going to do this. I mean, pretty gutsy, right? Tries to table it. Nope, we're going to do this. And so President Kimball then turns to Elder McConkey for support. And Elder McConkey stands up and gives a 10-minute oration of why the ban needed to be lifted. Mm-hmm. And essentially, he reiterates all the things that he told President Kimball in his 1977 memo, that the church had to globalize, that there was no scriptural impediment, that Black people could be adopted to the house of Israel. And later on, at BruceRMcConkey's death in 1985, Boyd Packer, Elder McConkey's close friend, reads a statement. And he said that this is at his funeral, McConkey's funeral, and by this point, Kimball would have been dead too. But Elder Packer read a statement at McConkey's funeral, and he said that President Kimball always praised Elder McConkey for the special support he had given with the revelation. And by special support, he meant by helping to win over Benson. And so Elder Benson, to his credit, realizes that he's outnumbered and goes along with it, feels like, I'm not going to question his motives. He just gave into pressure. I find that hard to believe, right? Elder Benson's his own man. He's a pretty fierce, he's got his own convictions and opinions.
Sure.
So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he changed in the moment, that he felt that this is what God wanted. And afterwards, President Kimball calls Elder Peterson in Ecuador. And it's really telling, the conversation. He says, yeah, we lifted the ban today, Mark. It was Mark. Mm-hmm. We lifted the ban today, Mark. And Elder Peterson's first response was, well, did all the brethren agree to it? Yes, they did, Mark. And okay, well, I suppose I won't stand in the way. That is hardly a ringing endorsement. And Elder Peterson asked President Kimball that when you publish the revelation or the announcement, can you put a disclaimer in the Deseret News next to it, reiterating the fact that Black and white people should not marry? And that's obviously a problem, right? If you're a Black Latter-day Saint, for a number of reasons.
Yes.
Why is that still an issue if the ban's been lifted? And number two, what the heck am I supposed to do if I'm a Black saint and there are a few eligible Black people to date in the church? Mm-hmm. Do I marry a white person? No, because that's interracial marriage, according to Peterson. Or do I marry a Black person outside of the church? Well, no, the church wants you to marry in the church.
Yeah.
So his disclaimer, creates a lot of problems. And I talk about some of these voices of Black saints who articulate the discomfort they felt when they read that disclaimer in the Deseret News. So let me say one last point about this topic.
Yes, please.
President Kimball was a genius when it came to leadership. He didn't use his office to coerce, to cajole. I mean, he really, really presented it as a theological problem. How are we supposed to fulfill our scriptural mandate to globalize the church if we've got this ban? And, he shared the same concerns. President Kimball was not some progressive with interracial marriage. That was one of the things they really were worried about. And also, President Kimball, this is going to be hard for maybe some listeners to hear, but he was a mover and a shaker. He knew how to get things done. And sometimes when there were holdouts in the quorum with some of the policy initiatives that he wanted to push forward, and he couldn't get their buy-in, he would send them away on church assignments. And he would make sure that he had a quorum of, 8 apostles back in Salt Lake. He would then get the unanimity that he needed, and then he would let the 1 or 2 or 3 apostle holdouts, wherever they were, he would let them know, hey, we did this while you were away. And that's what he did with Elder Peterson and Elder Stapley. And, I don't know. To me, that's just, you're getting some things done, especially when you feel like you're the church president. You feel like you speak for the church. You have all the keys to run the church. This is what God wants. And what do you do when you have 1 or 2 holdouts? You can only wait so long.
Yeah. I want to take a break here. When we come back in the third block, I want to talk about where we're at with Black members of the church today, where it's been since the lifting of both the temple and the priesthood ban. And we'll get into some of that stuff as we come back in the third block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJInUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJInUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now. BestDJInUtah.com. Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember that you can become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall. You can go to patreon.com/the Cultural Hall, where for as little as $5 a month, you can help support this work into the future. Remember that you get to be a part of the secret but not sacred Facebook group that all the Patreon saints are hanging out in, where we have all sorts of great conversations, some that have to do with the episodes that we're talking about, and others that are like, oh man, did you see how many books Matt Harris had behind him? I saw that he had, and we'll talk about just the most random of things in that group. Patreon.com/the Cultural Hall. So Matt, one of the things that I know, I wasn't alive at the time that the ban was lifted, but anyone who was will be able to tell you, I remember exactly where I was when the ban was lifted. I was driving on the freeway and this, that, and the other. I was here. I remember hearing it from the friend, and some said I instantly believed it. Some say I wept. Some that I have talked to have said, I couldn't believe it. I didn't, I wondered if this was misinformation that was being spread. We had the opportunity a while back, and I'll leave a link for this in the show notes. Episode 417, we had the opportunity to talk to Joseph Freeman Jr., who was the first individual who was ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood after the ban was lifted. It's an amazing conversation. If you haven't heard his story, take the moment to do it. The question that I have is this. For years and years and years and years, we said, nope. President Kimball says yes. And then everyone is faced with the question of, okay, so yesterday you said no. And because of these very, as you mentioned, like we tried to find the source for it, the biblical sources of the curses and the, we don't know, but something kind of explanation about it. And then the next day, faithful members of the church are faced with just changing 180 degrees. How has it been that the church has defended that since then, or explained that, or have we? And this book is just another way to hopefully shed some light on the explanation of it all.
Well, the church, good question. The church hasn't done itself a service, in my opinion, explaining the ban. And it's kind of hard to explain to somebody who's not a Latter-day Saint that, my church thinks that you're cursed.
Right.
Or my church thinks that you did something in the pre-existence, that you didn't follow Jesus's plan, you followed Satan's plan. I mean, that's hard to swallow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were less valiant, or you were a fence sitter. You couldn't decide whose plan to follow. I mean, it's just tough stuff to explain to anybody. It's also tough.
Hold on. I want to interrupt you real quick, because those sound like those are just so over the top explanations, but to maybe millennial and younger listeners of the Cultural Hall, that is how members of the church explained it. Oh, you were a fence sitter in heaven. That's why you've got, dark skin. Oh, you were cursed by the line of Ham. Like that. It sounds now almost farcical or just absolutely so ridiculous. But that is how it was explained.
It was. And if you think about this, there's a couple of problems with this theology. One is, of course, your beautiful black and brown skin is the sign of God's wrath, his displeasure, because you have done something wrong to offend him. And I mean, just think about that for a moment, that your beautiful black and brown skin is a sign of divine disfavor. Also, it's bad theology in the sense that black people are inheriting the multi-generational sins of their ancestors. It contradicts Mormon theology that we'll be judged for our own sins and not for Adam's transgression, right? And the brethren, I'm not going to criticize them. I'm just going to try to help to understand them. They've inherited this doctrine, this larger racism from the broader society. And so they have a hard time explaining the doctrine by the civil rights era. And by 1969, when a lot of mainline Protestant and Catholic churches are readjusting their theology to accommodate racial equality, the saints, the First Presidency decided that they want to take a different tact. They don't want to talk about the less valiant, the neutral, the pre-existence, the curses. They made a statement in April of 1968. They said that to top church leaders, they said, let's not talk about those rationales for the ban. Anything we say should be clear, positive, and brief. And a year later, they devise a wholly new statement. And it's a First Presidency statement they released in December of 1969. And they say that the reasons for the ban are not known. So that if members are asked why the ban had occurred, you can say, we don't know. Now, that's a really, really difficult theological point, because Elder McConkey, Joseph Fielding Smith, and others have been writing these big books talking about, we do know why the ban occurred, because black people are cursed. They were less valiant. But now they create this public relations line, and that's all that it is. It's a public relations line because they don't know how to deal with these very difficult LDS racial teachings. And so that we don't know line has a staying power well into the 21st century. Even today, Richie, if you talk to some Latter-day Saints, they will tell you, we don't know why the ban existed. That is not a strong position. I can't tell you how many church leaders just talked to a mission president recently, and I said, don't ever say that. Don't ever say that, because we do know why the ban existed. And let's just be transparent. It came about in 1852, and there were 4 million Africans enslaved. Brigham Young absorbed some of those views, a lot of those views. And so it was simply born out of racism from its 19th century roots. And so what happens is, by the 21st century, the we don't know line gets replaced for a short period by a folklore line, that it's really just folklore, the LDS racial teachings. That's a problematic line as well, because Elder McConkey wrote a book with the word doctrine in the title. Joseph Fielding Smith wrote a book called Doctrines of Salvation. The First Presidency released 2 statements in 49 and 69 calling it doctrine. So to call it folklore in the 21st century is yet a way to distance the church from those prior teachings. And the brethren, they don't want to get in the business, of course, of correcting their fellow brethren. So it becomes folklore for a short period. And the internet will explode all of this.
Yeah.
It's hard to call it folklore when somebody on, 2 clicks of the mouse can find the Journal of Discourses. Years ago, before the internet, the church could control the narrative, relatively speaking, because people would have to go to a research library in order to sift out Brigham Young's teachings or some other leaders. But today, it's just all right here in front of you. And so I'm happy to note that in 2013, the Brethren released a statement called Race and the Priesthood, and it was part of the Gospel Topics essay series. I've written about this extensively, about how these essays came about.
Which, a
And
quick aside, man, if you are loving this, all of Matt's work is so great on this. I'll leave links to all of these things in the show notes. If this is the thing that you just love being able to know more and more and more about, Matt, I would very comfortably say, if not the leading most scholar on this particular topic, one of only a handful of others. And I just, being able to read as you put it and being able to understand the way that you put things together has been invaluable for me in not only understanding, but just learning about everything around this.
yeah, thank you. So the Race and the Priesthood essay it's a wonderful statement because it tackles head on all of the racial lore that had accumulated over the centuries. And it repudiates the curse. It repudiates the idea that interracial marriage is a sin. It repudiates the teaching that Black people had done something wrong in their pre-existence to offend God. I mean, it just goes on and on. And if there's a brother at church or anywhere else in the LDS community who spouts these old teachings, somebody can raise this document and say, that is not what the church teaches today. And I've been telling people within earshot, I go to history conferences and I frequently talk with LDS archivists who work for they call me about my research. And I always tell them that transparency is always the best route for the church. Whenever you try to sugarcoat something or sweep it under the rug, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And not that people are trying to, they just don't know how to deal with these things. And so sometimes it's easier to not want to talk about it or to sweeten it. But I always tell people that it shouldn't be a stretch of anyone's imagination to think that Joseph Fielding Smith, who's born in 1876, had racist views, right? Or that he supported segregation, or that Brigham Young had racist views. Shouldn't be earth-shattering. As a historian, what's more interesting is, how did Brigham Young differ, or how is he similar from his contemporaries? How is he different or similar from the prophet Joseph Smith? And so to recognize that leaders were racists and products of their culture and that had racist views that were common in their generation, that should not be shocking to people. The story here should not be to sugarcoat and to sweeten, because millennials and others they see right through that.
Yes.
The story is, yes, it's true. President so-and-so was a racist back in the day. It's true. He was influenced by the broader American culture. But this is what the church teaches today. And that's why that Race and the Priesthood essay is so significant, because people could really share that. And I really wish this were not true, but I wish that essay and the other essays in that series had a greater circulation. Sometimes I'm still astonished that they've been out since 2013, a number of them, and there's still a number of Latter-day Saints who don't know anything about them. Mm-hmm. And they're really cutting edge work, because this is the church's effort at trying to be transparent.
Yeah, and available in the Gospel Library app for people who want to check them out there. You can find them online. It's interesting to me when you talk about, birth year and existence of life. You look present day, President Nelson to celebrate 100 years of living this year, which to me is fascinating, because then I think that is a gentleman who was 54 at the lifting of the priesthood ban. And that, to me, I don't know, and I'm not projecting any sort of things, but to say that during his life he had probably been around individuals who held racist views is a surety. And I look at my life, and when I have established the views that I have created, like a lot of those views are established in your 20s and 30s. Now, hear me very clearly. I think that President Nelson, and I hope that you can speak to this as well, has done tremendous efforts in this vein of everything. But I just think it is a fascinating look that for more than half of President Nelson's life to date, the priesthood ban was in existence, and that likely in church meetings that he and others participated in were still taught of the curse and all of these things. Temple and priesthood ban is lifted, and then he is able to step in and do what he has done. Would you say that he has done, that is, President Nelson has done the work necessary to lift these saints out of being second-class citizens, or is there still a lot of work left to do?
A lot of work left to do. And it's important to let people grow, right? President Nelson, I suspect if he were in the room participating in this conversation, Richie, he would probably tell you that he supported the church's race teachings. And he had common assumptions about Black people born from somebody like him, born in 1923.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so this isn't unusual. The more interesting thing for me as a scholar is to see people's growth. You see this with President Kimball. I mean, President Kimball in 1978 was not the person he was in 1943 when he was called into the Quorum of the 12. I mean, you're not the same person today. I'm not. Hopefully we evolve for the better, right? As
yes.
humans. And President Nelson, I think, needs to be put in context. And he has done something, or he's sort of taken the baton and run with the baton that Gordon Hinckley had figuratively given him. Gordon Hinckley, when he was the church president in 1995, and even before that, he decided that he needed to make it right with the Black community. And after years of scars and trauma, being told that they're cursed, also the political baggage from Elder Benson, his colleague, calling the NAACP, this esteemed civil rights group, calling them communist. And Elder Benson, unfortunately, and some others in the church had called the NAACP, Dr. King and others in the movement, communists. So needless to say, the NAACP did not have a good view of the church, and the church didn't have a good view of the NAACP. And President Hinckley did something. I'm going to tell you something on air today that I've told nobody else. And President Hinckley is working his magic behind the scenes to repair the relationship. And he starts out in the early 90s when he asked a church colleague, somebody who works in the church bureaucracy, to join the NAACP board. And this would have been 1991. In 1986, President Hinckley oversees an effort to bring Rosa Parks to Utah. This is in 86. President Benson, I can imagine, would never agree to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's 91 he brings Rosa Parks in. I'm sorry, I'm messing this up. It's Coretta Scott King they bring in 86. It's Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so President Hinckley sees to it that the church pays a significant chunk to bring Coretta Scott King in. And President Hinckley recognizes that if you're going to repair this racial breach, it begins with relationships. And President Nelson will also understand that point. And so President Nelson, like President Hinckley, had begun to make friends with members of the Black community. Hinckley does this. Hinckley even speaks at the NAACP convention in the spring of 1998, the first for a Mormon leader. So President Nelson picks up on the wonderful outreach work that President Hinckley had been doing, and Nelson forms friendships with several NAACP leaders, and they recognize that he's doing his part to fight racism. And just last year, I wish I had this in time for my book. I didn't. But last year, I talk about Nelson and Hinckley, of course, their great work with outreach, but I wasn't able to put in the fact that the NAACP awarded President Nelson an award for his community outreach with the NAACP and his help fighting racism. So the church has also, under Nelson's watch, given lots of money to the NAACP, scholarships for Black men and women, and also money to help build buildings for the NAACP when they had buildings that were in disrepair. And so the NAACP, they're responding in kind and praising President Nelson and other leaders for the work the church is doing. This never could have happened if it wasn't for Hinckley recognizing that the church needed to make it right with the Black community. And at least with the NAACP, the national office, the church has good standing today, largely because of RussellMNelson.
I know a discussion, and maybe this is where we sort of end our time today, but I know a discussion among a lot of Black Latter-day Saints and others have said the church really needs to apologize in order for this to heal. And I have talked to some people who have thought, well, what would that apology even sound like? And how do you apologize for the thousands, hundreds of thousands of saints who weren't able to receive their temple blessings? And like, how would you even begin to word that? And other people have said, it doesn't matter. You make the effort, you do the very best that you can, and you make that apology, and that is how healing will truly come. Where do you weigh in on that? Is the apology the only way for healing to occur?
No, no. An apology has to be first and foremost. The church has to own up to its theology and how it's affected Black families. I mean, think about this for a moment, Richie. We mentioned a minute ago that the church said that they didn't know why the ban occurred. That's deeply problematic because the church has always had a theology that offers answers to life's most important questions. But when it comes to the salvation of millions of Black and biracial people around the world, you don't know why. That's a tough one. And so the church needs to apologize, much as other Protestant faiths did in the 1990s. They had these reconciliation moments in which they offer public apologies for the racist teachings they had once taught. And so the church needs to do that. That's the first step. The second step is there needs to be more Black leadership in the church. I mean, in the United States, less than 3% of the church ranks are people who are African Americans. I mean, when you see white faces everywhere, and I realize parenthetically that the church is diversifying a little bit. I get that. But the fact is, we've only had one African American general authority. We've only had a handful of international Black general authorities. And so African Americans in the United States, they want to see themselves represented in church leadership. That has to happen. And then the big one, and this is something that I'm not afraid of talking about, and this is part of the healing that needs to occur in the church. I hear from Black saints all the time, and their stories are so soul crushing. I mean, I feel their pain as much as I can as a white man. And the church needs sensitivity training. When President Nelson and President Oaks get up in conference or at BYU devotionals and they talk about, don't be a racist, it offends God. That's wonderful. I applaud that. But the problem is that most of the people who hear this, they don't think it applies to them.
Yeah.
They don't know what the racism looks like. And I tell my friends, for example, during the Black Lives Matter moment, when they say something like, oh, all lives matter, that is the most callous thing one could say. Because in that moment, it was Black men in particular who were getting brutalized by law enforcement. I'm not here to say that law enforcement are all like that, because they're not. Most of them are wonderful and do their jobs ethically and professionally. But for the few that were not doing their jobs like they should and were traumatizing the Black community, to say that all lives matter, that is such a callous indifference to the suffering of our Black brothers and sisters. Of course, all lives matter, but all lives can't matter until we look at the hardships that Black lives have faced. And so that's a kind of racial sensitivity training that the church needs. And when I go to conferences and I talk to people who work for the church, they oftentimes pull me in the corner and they ask me these things. What do you think? They know racism's a problem. And I usually tell them the same thing. We need racial sensitivity training. I also tell them that the racism in the church today is less theological. The millennials that you referred to a minute ago, they're not being told anymore that Black people bear this divine curse so that they were less valiant. That's just sort of fading away from the church, which is good.
Yes.
But it's political racism that they're experiencing now, where people use race as a cudgel to divide Americans. And one of my friends, Darius Gray's a longstanding member of the church, a Black man. He joined in 1964. He's done some really heroic work in the Black LDS community and also with the Brethren. And he's often told me that the people with whom he comes in contact have these views that deal with party affiliation, partisan politics, that really prevent racial healing in the pews, because people still look at some Latter-day Saints look at Black people with such a jaundiced eye. And that's one of the reasons why Darius Gray also thinks that there ought to be an apology. And so it's less concerning about what I think as a white man. And this is one of those times where our Black and brown sisters and brothers, that their voices should be privileged.
Yeah, and I have sort of ruminated on it. I'm like, why don't church leaders apologize? And I don't know if it's because then some question fallibility of things. Well, if they were wrong about this, then what? Like, I don't know if church leadership is fearful of the dissonance that creates, or if they don't know how people would deal with it if we apologize. To me, it just seems, having been married twice I know that you always apologize if the if the need is there, if the offense is created, there is rarely the time that when you apologize, you come away from it and go, nope, shouldn't apologize. Boy, I wish hadn't done that. I think it feels like the healing and the next step.
Well, I think Elder Oaks, I think, said something challenging about 7 or 8 years ago when he said that the church does not apologize, nor do we seek them. And that was difficult for myself and others to hear, because that's essentially contrary to church teachings, contrary to scriptures, that when we do something wrong, we should apologize.
Right.
And Elder Oaks is a lawyer, I'm sure, has liability things in mind, doesn't want to leave the church open to a lawsuit, perhaps. But there is precedent for apologizing. I mean, we apologized in 2007. Henry B. Eyring of the governing first presidency apologized at the Mountain Meadows Reconciliation Monument. The church had apologized when they told a Jewish organization they were no longer doing proxy baptisms for Holocaust victims, and turns out they were. I don't think the Brethren were not. I'm just speculating here. I don't think the Brethren knew that was still going on. I think it was just some eager beaver people doing it without church approval. But anyway, they apologized for that. So there is precedent for it. But I do think you're absolutely right, Richie, that if you apologize for X, people are going to want you to apologize for Y. But when I was growing up as a kid in primary, and I'm sure you had a similar experience, we were taught to do what is right, let the consequences follow. And that's how I've tried to live my life. And I wish that the church would apologize. Maybe they will, but it might take a new generation of leadership to do that.
Yeah. The name of the book is Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. Again, links to all the different interviews and different books that we talked about, documentary series, all the things. You will find those available in the show notes for this episode. Matt, I want to ask you, you have a couple of irons in the fire. I want to commit you right now to coming back, because you're doing a work, I hope I'm right about this, because I didn't ask you before we started recording. You're doing a work on HughBBrown right now. Is that right, to come out in the future?
I am. I'm knee deep in HughBBrown. It's going to be a great story.
Now, the idea of HughBBrown, and we'll maybe only tease this, but HughBBrown, I need a HughBBrown in my apostleship today. A guy who's not afraid to go to the press and say, well, I didn't say it, everybody, but you need to go ahead and ask this. I need a pot stirrer. I need a HughBBrown today. And that's going to be a full biography. Tell me a little bit about that project that's coming up.
Yeah, it's going to be a full biography. I got access to the Brown papers. So I have diaries, letters. And for your audience who may not know this, he was the most gifted public speaker in the church in the 20th century. He, in my Second Class Saints book, he pushes against the priesthood ban, which I go into great detail. He gets released from the first presidency in 1970 because of his activism. He speaks to the press when the Brethren were not listening to him to make the changes that he thought were needed. He's a liberal Democrat from Canada who is called into a quorum full of conservative Republicans from the Intermountain West. What could go wrong? And he would often write in his diary and elsewhere, I'm the only liberal in the church leadership. I'm lonely. So he was cut from a different cloth, and needless to say, that didn't always fly well at church headquarters.
Do you think that there is a HughBBrown among the current, I mean, certainly not the great orator or as much of a pot stirrer, but certainly my mind goes to one of the apostles to say one of these kids is not like the other. And do you feel like there is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously President Uchtdorf or Elder Uchtdorf would be the most common one, but he's a Democrat. We know this. He's given money to the Democratic Party. He shouldn't have. It came out that he did rather than his family. The Brethren are not supposed to give money to political parties. Their families can, but they can't. Anyway, he did it. But I don't have any evidence that he's an activist. I don't have access to the quorum minutes where he's, advocating for some liberal cause. I'd like to think that he has a voice along those lines, but I don't know that. But I certainly know that some of the sermons that he's given over the last, 10 or 12, 15 years were definitely different, including one in 2013 where he said something that probably floored a lot of people in the church. he said that there were times in the past where the leaders have taught things that have taught people to question, meaning question their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And he also went on to say that we haven't always got the story wrong. We made mistakes. He didn't say for what, but he said we made mistakes. And he also said something revealing that I talk about in my Gospel Topics Essays book. He said that I wish we wouldn't talk that people leave the church because of sin or the fact that they had their feelings hurt. And as I point out in my Gospel Topics essay, when I contextualize why these essays came about, President Uchtdorf had seen a big survey about LDS disaffection. And leaving because of sin or having their feelings hurt was not even in the top 15 reasons. And so he had seen that, and that's what led him to say those words in the 2013 General Conference.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about HughBBrown. So here's the commitment. When that book is ready to go, will you come back and visit with me all about that?
I would. I'd be happy to, Richie.
Oh, I love it. I love our conversation. Again, Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality. Purchase the book. Is there an audiobook for folks that like to listen to a book? Did you read it or someone else?
Yeah, so good question. I just checked on that. I've been bombarded with that same question. And they are in the process now, OxfordUniversityPress, my publisher, they're working with a third party to do that, to license the rights. But there is a Kindle version, there's a hardback version, as you mentioned, and then the audio hopefully will be out the next few months, I hope.
One of the things, just in closing on this thing, that I absolutely love about your book is, some people may come to this and be like, oh, what does Matt know? He's purporting these things. We always like to discredit the author because if it's challenging, maybe he's anti-whatever. Half of your book is notes and connection, a bibliography to say, this is where I got this is where this is from. So it is worthwhile in every aspect of it. Second Class Saints. Matt, I appreciate you being here in the Cultural Hall with us. We hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, Rick McGee, Debbie Wanless, Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and the Tiger with a U will be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back